Okay, good afternoon. This is the Rondeli Foundation, and we have the honor and the pleasure to have with us today the Ambassador of the State of Israel, Ambassador Gidor. Ambassador, welcome to our office, GFSIS, and we have plenty of issues to discuss with you. We are very happy that you are visiting us and participate in this Rondeli discussions, and as a first ambassador who participates in this, welcome in this discussion. So let me start right away. I have a lot of issues related to the Middle East peace process, the Abraham records, but first and foremost, I would like to start with the issue which grabbed my attention earlier this month, and I just want to, not to be mistaken and be legally correct, the earlier this month, a decision was made that the pretrial chamber of the International Criminal Court has determined that The Hague has jurisdiction to open a criminal investigation into Israel and the Palestinians for war crimes alleged to have taken place in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. I know that the Prime Minister Netanyahu has rejected and responded to that decision, and last week, exactly 1 week ago, the court issued the statement, fact sheet, which is contradicting with the Prime Minister's position. How serious is this for the State of Israel? How big is the concern that this could really happen, that one day International Criminal Court can start the investigation against the militaries or against the Israelis based on this decision?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to say that for me it's not just an honor, but it's a pleasure to be here today. I was posted to Georgia once before in the late 90s, between 97 and 2000, and then I had the pleasure of meeting Alex Rondeli and becoming his friend. I was saddened when I heard about his death, but visiting the foundation that is named after him is both a pleasure and an honor. As to your question, yes, the decision, the ruling of the pre-trial court of the ICC, the International Criminal Court in The Hague, is taken extremely seriously by Israel, and not just Israel. And I will explain why. Those countries that are signatories to the Treaty of Rome, which gave rise, which created the ICC, are also members of the ICC. Israel is not one of them. The US is not one of them. There are many countries in the world that chose not to join the ICC. And the reason why we chose not to do so is because, unfortunately, judging by our experience in multilateral organizations, we know that Israel is always being singled out. Every year at the General Assembly of the United Nations, there are 24 resolutions passed against Israel almost automatically for several decades. So, as a democracy, we are perfectly capable of dealing with our own internal issues, and if there are soldiers who misbehave or act against regulations or against orders, then we are perfectly capable of putting them on trial and dealing with them ourselves. We don't need any external court or tribunal to tell us what to do. However, what happened now is that a few years ago, the Prosecutor General of the ICC applied to the court and asked, is Palestine, is the Palestinian Authority a state? Because the Palestinians did sign the Treaty of Rome, unlike Israel and the US. And 2 weeks ago, the judges said, yes, for the purposes of the ICC, Palestine is qualified to be a member. In other words, they said, it's not our business to decide whether Palestine is a state in the real world. But for the purposes of the ICC, it's enough that they join, that they signed it. Now, it's important to stress that out of 3 judges, one was completely opposed to this, the president of the court, and unfortunately he was overruled by the other 2. Now, what does it mean? And this is very relevant also to Georgia. It means that
that was my next question. It's really interesting.
Exactly.
Is this a dangerous precedent?
It's an extremely dangerous precedent because it means that that entities that are not recognized internationally as states can join international conventions and treaties and take sovereign states to account. Now, as we all know, Abkhazia and South Ossetia belong to Georgia. They're part of Georgian sovereignty. They haven't been recognized as sovereign independent states except by a handful of capitals, Syria, Venezuela, Moscow. Let's imagine a situation whereby Abkhazia goes to the ICC and accuses Georgia of war crimes.
But they will need to join
sign the Treaty of Rome.
The Treaty of
Yes,
Rome.
but if once the court decided that the Palestinian Authority is a state for the purposes of the Treaty of Rome, then who's to stop Abkhazia and South Ossetia and many other territories?
At least it will give them the temptation to start this process and to working in this direction.
Absolutely. Now, let's discuss the facts for a second. The ICC, ever since it was established, enjoyed an enormous budget of 1.5 billion USD. 1.5 billion USD. Can you imagine what Georgia could have done with this amount of money? And with this, they achieved 5 convictions, which means that only five, which means that the average cost of one conviction is $300 million US.
Ambassador, I'm not good at the judiciary. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a diplomat, but. I quite don't understand. Is this the case for discussions or investigations of these Holocaust type crimes, or is this just a misbehavior of the armed forces? I don't quite understand. I don't see the court is investigating the real terrible crimes in Syria which are taking place.
This is a very good point that you're making. The court was established in order to investigate and punish perpetrators who are responsible for major crimes against humanity. We're talking about mass-scale massacres, genocides, things like that. Not about individual acts that may amount to crimes, but they're nowhere near the scale that justifies an external intervention. And indeed, when you look at everything that's happening as we speak, here and now in the Middle East, in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Yemen, and other places, the fact that the ICC is choosing to focus on the one democracy in the Middle East that has proven time and again that we are completely transparent, that we are perfectly capable of adjudicating and judging our own people and even punishing them whenever it's necessary, that shows once again that the ICC, as unfortunately many other multilateral organizations, suffer from politicization. Now, in the Oslo peace accords between the Palestinians and Israel, it was said specifically that the issue of sovereignty of the future Palestinian state would be determined through bilateral negotiation. What the Palestinians are trying to do right now is to internationalize the conflict. They are not prepared to sit down at the negotiation table with Israel. Instead, they're taking their case to various international multilateral organizations in the hope that those organizations will recognize them as a state.
Last question on this investigation issue. How do you see the further developments? Do you expect, I saw that certain countries, a number of countries, Germany, Hungary, I think, and others opposed to this kind of decision. How do you see that? Do you expect that one day, really, in the upcoming nearest future, we can witness the starting of the investigation?
This is an open question because the prosecutor general herself is due to step down in June. But the problem is that once the ICC has chosen to go down the political route, then anything could happen. And in the past, there have been attempts to issue arrest warrants against leading Israeli politicians. In Israel, as you probably know, everyone has to go to the army. There is mandatory military service. I served in the army, my children, my parents, my siblings, everyone served in the army. So in theory, there's nothing to stop NGOs or other organizations using the universal jurisdiction principle or some derivative from the ICC in order to try and embarrass foreign governments into arresting Israelis. We hope it will not come to that because, as you said yourself, several highly respected Western countries already issued statements rejecting the ICC ruling.
Okay, so now let's move to the peace process. You mentioned the negotiations between you and the Palestinians on making the peace process and deciding the fortune of the Palestine as a state. Is the two-state solution still on table?
As far as we're concerned, there's never been any alternative to the two-state solution. Our former Prime Minister and former President, Shimon Peres, used to say that when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, it's not true to say that you don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. You see the light, you don't see the tunnel. So we all know what's going to happen at the end of the process.
Okay.
And the two-state solution is that light at the end of the tunnel. It's the process that is problematic because we are suffering from decades of mutual mistrust and suspicion. And both leaderships have to be able to sit across the table from each other and negotiate.
Can these so-called Abraham records be helpful to the process of the solution of the two-state resolution of this conflict?
Absolutely. I think the Palestinians have been traditionally relying on the axiom, on the assumption that there's some kind of solidarity within the Arab world and other Arab nations will sacrifice their own interests in order to support the Palestinians, even though the Palestinians refuse to negotiate seriously with Israel. This axiom has been proven wrong time and again. In 1979, we had a peace treaty with Egypt, then we had peace treaty with Jordan, and now in just a couple of months, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. So that shows that in the 21st century, each country looks after its own selfish interests, and there's nothing wrong with that. That doesn't mean that Egypt, Jordan, the UAE, and others don't have some sympathy towards the Palestinian cause, of course. But the Palestinians have to realize that ultimately there's no escape from sitting down and negotiating seriously in good faith.
Could Saudi Arabia be next in that line of the countries of establishing the diplomatic relationship?
We very much hope so, and it's already been published by the international media that there have been some tentative contacts, and we are very pleased to know that the Saudi authorities are now allowing Israeli civilian flights to cross Saudi airspace on their way to the Gulf, and the signs are looking good, but who knows, I certainly wouldn't want to jump into conclusions, especially since we're facing...
Does Israel communicate with and negotiate with other states from the Arab world?
Absolutely.
Besides Saudi Arabia?
Absolutely, yes.
Should we expect some good news for Israel in upcoming weeks and months?
I hope so, but first of all, this is way above my pay grade as Israeli ambassador to Tbilisi, and secondly, as you probably know, next month we are facing yet another general election in Israel, the fourth election in 2 years. So we will see what happens after the political scene is restabilized in Israel.
Okay, now let us move to the issue of the Iran's nuclear program. And I can't miss this opportunity. We have read and seen a number of statements by U.S. top administration representatives, the Secretary of State, were talking about how close is Iran to create the nuclear weapon. Just recently, I saw in the news that the International Atomic Energy Agency has negotiated the limited accept of the inspectors to the facilities. How close is Iran really, and how do you expect? What do you expect from the new Biden administration? Would they come back to the 2015 nuclear deal, and will there be the positive reaction from the Israeli side?
Okay, this question is very important, and we could spend hours discussing it.
Yeah.
I will try and be very concise.
I put three questions together.
I will try and be very concise. First of all, every military nuclear project in history always had three components: the fissile material, be it uranium or plutonium; the delivery system, usually a missile or a bomb; and the warhead, the explosive warhead. So three components. Now, in the case of Iran, they've been testing ballistic missiles for at least 2 decades. And some of the missiles have had Israel within range for at least 15 years. We're talking about ballistic missiles that have a range of 3,000 kilometers. Mm-hmm. And they already have a space program, which means that those missiles going into space could be converted for military use. So that's the delivery system. As for the warhead, there are documents that were contained in a laptop that was handed over by an Iranian defector to a Western government over a decade ago.
I've seen the presentation.
Yeah, that showed that Iran has been trying to produce a conical warhead that can only fit one purpose, nuclear bomb. Now we're left with the fissile material. According to the agreement that was reached in 2015, Iran is allowed to enrich only up to 3.67% uranium. However, now, as of last year, Iran started enriching to 4.5%, yes. And as of last month, they're enriching to 20%. 20. Now, what is important to understand, and I'm not a nuclear physicist, is that the amount of time it takes to enrich from 0 to 10 is much longer than it takes to enrich from 10 to 20. The higher you enrich, the less time it takes. So when they've already enriched 17
which is the dangerous level? What percent?
More or less around, for military purposes, it's more or less 90%.
90%.
Yeah. But the time and effort and energy it takes to enrich from 20 to 90 is less than what it takes from 0 to 20. You see, this is why it's so dangerous.
I see.
So instead of enriching to 3.67, they're now enriching to 20%. According to the agreement, they are not allowed to use FODO. FODO is the secret deep underground enrichment facility. Yeah. They're only allowed to use Natanz, which is relatively exposed.
But they are using FODO.
Now they're using FODO as well, which means that it's heavily protected, not accessible to oversight from above. Then, according to the agreement, they are only allowed to use 5,000 centrifuges of the most primitive variant, IR1, in Natanz. Now they started installing IR2, IR4, and IR6, which have 6 times the speed level than IR1, which means that actually in just a few months, they have enriched more uranium in terms of quantity to a higher degree, and they're installing much more sophisticated advanced centrifuges.
Do you believe that will, if the United States re-enters the nuclear deal, it will stop Iran of the...
Well, our concern is that Iran has already made such progress that it will be very impossible to roll it back. Mm-hmm. And what's even more significant is the fact that they've acquired practical experience and scientific know-how, which they can't unlearn. They can't forget what they've acquired. Now, on top of that, it's important to understand why there's a difference of approach between Israel and the US. There are several reasons for that. First of all, we have been within range of Iranian missiles already for over a decade. America is not within range.
Yeah.
For them, it's more of an academic, theoretical exercise. For us, it's an existential threat.
Yes.
Secondly, Iran and America have been more or less negotiating directly and indirectly for several years now. With us, Iran is not prepared to negotiate. Now, when we stop for a moment and ask
Are
us...
you prepared to negotiate
Absolutely.
with Iran?
Well, I will tell you something. My father used to travel to Tehran every month up to the Islamic Revolution in 1979. And overnight, we became little Satan. America is big Satan. I think the UK is medium-sized Satan. We are little Satan. But why? I mean, we don't share a border with Iran. We never fought a war with Iran. We don't occupy Iranian territories. What's the grievance here? So sitting in the 21st century here, we are wearing ties, we are using sophisticated technology. We think that countries go to war over interests, territory, oil. But in this case, it's biblical, it's medieval, We are the infidels, and that's the end of the story. Even if we had the most peacenik left-wing government in Israel that said to Iran, take whatever you want, let's just have peace. There's nothing we can give them in exchange for peace. Simply existing as Israeli Jews, this is anathema to them. So this is why we can't take any kind of risk. We have to use the worst case scenario in our calculations, not the best case scenario. And our nation was established by Holocaust survivors, refugees. So collectively we have this trauma of the Holocaust. We will never again accept the risk of being annihilated.
I see. Very last question about the bilateral relationship between Israel and Georgia. What are the perspectives? You are the champions in vaccination. We are still behind the schedule. So how it helps to open the economy in Israel, and how it helps to open the economic ties, the investment opportunities between Israel and Georgia?
Yeah. First of all, it's not a secret that Israel and Georgia have always enjoyed intimate relationships.
Yes, absolutely.
Right from the start, the Israeli embassy was the fourth embassy to open in Tbilisi. The problem is that I think that both our nations have become hostage to tradition. We like to toast each other, the great friendship, 26 centuries of friendship, and we focus more on the past than the future. This is where I see my own, personal priority in trying to put the bilateral relationship back on track towards a kind of a mature, sophisticated bilateral relations that are enjoyed.
Emotions in combination with the practical benefits.
Exactly. Now, in respect of COVID, yes, Israel holds the world record in terms of vaccination. We don't yet have the kind of yardstick as to how it affects the economy, because we are still under almost total lockdown in Israel, and even Tel Aviv International Airport is closed. However, we are seeing the number of infections gradually going down.
Yes.
So there's every reason to be optimistic about returning to a more or less normal modus operandi towards the late spring. Also, our economy is being less hit than initially feared. And one of the reasons is because our economy is mostly based on high-tech exports.
Yes.
So people can do it from home. It's all about brain power. It's not about hard commodities. And this is something that we've been focusing on in Georgia for the past few years, creating a Georgian Tbilisi-based ecosystem that could serve as like an engine for the Georgian economy. Because everyone knows Georgia has great wine and nuts and tourism, but these are all things that God gave Georgia.
Yeah.
When it comes to human effort, we
have to create ourselves.
Yes, and Georgia is very lucky to enjoy free trade agreements with the EU and other major trading partners. So I think creating a hub for high-tech, for innovation, for startups is something that we have the experience and we're more than willing to share with our Georgian partners, and it already exists. There is an Israeli tech hub in Tbilisi that trains young Georgian students for a diploma a few months, and by the end of the course, they're virtually all guaranteed online jobs with Israeli high-tech companies.
Wow.
Yeah, this is just one of many examples. And our embassy is cooperating with JITA, the Georgian Institute of Technology, in training the next generation of Georgian startup and high-tech entrepreneurs. So I think this is the niche that we can aim for in order to boost the Georgian economy in the post-COVID period.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. It was really great to have this interview with you, and I hope very much in further close cooperation and discussions on various issues globally and locally here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.